Hey, everybody. We are gathering. Hopefully you just got the alert and you are going to interrupt whatever you're doing because you need a little time to hang out and hear what we are going to talk about. You've been working hard all day and relax for at least a couple minutes. So if you can, join us. I'm going to give just a couple of seconds for people to convene and connect, and I will then ask the team that we have assembled here to take this topic, explain why today, and get into the details. Okay, let us go. Let me point to, I don't know if you're all going to see people laid out the same way I'm seeing them on my screen, so I will call on one of the deans of the Privacy and Civil Rights and Gay Rights Bar, and a scholar and friend and mentor of mine, the chair and founder of FPF, Chris Wolf.
Thanks.
Chris, hello, and quick introductory for those who don't know you as well as I.
Great, thanks very much, Jules. You make me feel old, but that's probably because I am old. So I'm really delighted to be with everybody here today. It's really an important topic, and one in which I've been paying a lot of attention over the years. I like to fashion myself as a civil rights lawyer as well as a privacy lawyer. I've been involved with the Anti-Defamation League for 30 years. And while they were originally founded to fight anti-Semitism, they are one of the biggest LGBT advocates around. And one aspect of their work, my work, has been on privacy, but I guess I'm best known in the LGBT privacy world for a case that I brought back in 1998 called McVeigh versus Cohen, which challenged the Navy's attempt to oust a sailor under Don't Ask, Don't Tell for the offense of trying to collect toys for his fellow shipmates. And if you're interested in that case, please read it.
Thanks, Chris. And I'll start with I won't say the youngest person on the call, although maybe she is, but I don't know. We're Caitlin, who's been the organizer of this call and a number of our efforts, the Christopher Wolf Diversity Fellow, one of the fellowships we've started to help bring people who are graduating and interested in entering the privacy realm. Companies all want people with experience. Organizations want people with experience. Where do you get the experience? And so we created this on-ramp where we can take advantage of some smart, bright young people and also provide a broad, diverse set of opportunities to bring people into the mix. So Caitlin, I'll let you introduce.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Jules. It's wonderful to be here with Christopher Wolf as the Christopher Wolf Legal Fellow. Like Jules mentioned, my name is Caitlin Ringrose. And I'm really happy to be here today because today is International Human Rights Day. On this day, 72 years ago, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was passed. And that's kind of why we decided to get together and have this conversation, especially in furtherance of the goals that are celebrated on this day to end discrimination, address inequalities, and encourage participation and solidarity. So happy to be here, happy to discuss LGBTQ privacy generally, and then also how certain types of data fall into existing categories of sensitive information.
Great, thanks, Caitlin. Let me go to Chris and Carlos, our friends at LGBT Tech, who we're delighted to partner with, not just today, but on a whole wide, long range. Been a great experience, super organization. Hope if you have not heard, you'll take a look, but I'll let Chris and Carlos tell you a bit more.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I'm Christopher Wood, Executive Director of LGBT Tech. And Jules and Chris and Caitlin and Sarah, thanks so much for including us today. I know our work over the last year, in particular around LGBTQ and privacy, has been very fulfilling, and we're very excited to launch a paper very soon, which we'll be diving into a little bit today. But most importantly, when we're looking at the LGBTQ community and technology, which we have since our very founding a little over 8 years ago, privacy has been a term that has consistently popped up in various forms. And so I'm really excited to dive deeper into this and continue the conversation and exploring where it's different for LGBTQ and why it's important. So I'm very excited to be here, and thanks for including us. I'll turn it over to Carlos.
Hi, everyone. Carlos Gutierrez, Deputy Director and General Counsel of LGBT Tech. I'm really happy to be here and joining this panel. I'm excited about the discussion we're about to have. For me, the issue of privacy and data is something that is obviously very personal as an LGBTQ individual. And the conversation that we're going to have that talks about how data is going to be, how it's sensitive data and how LGBTQ data specifically is used is something that I think is overdue. And something that we hope to open a discussion among not only this group but corporations and legislatures around the country to figure this out on a kind of a global scale. So thank you for having us here.
Last but not least, Sarah Jordan, back on the FPF team, one of the lead drivers of our machine learning, AI, and ethics work. Sarah, let me give you a moment.
Hi, thanks, Jules, and thanks, Carlos, Chris, and Caitlin. Pleasure to be here. Sarah Jordan, and I'm part of the FPF team working on artificial intelligence and ethics. And I think it's definitely one of those great times to start talking about the influence of SOGI data and LGBTQ data and how that influences what we do with algorithms in the drive to make sure that they comply with our ethical mandates and our ethical desires. So really looking forward to the rest of the conversation.
So you threw out
Thanks,
some terms, and maybe everybody generally knows what we're talking about, right? If we're talking about LGBTQ people, we're talking about information presumably that identifies that somebody has a particular sexual orientation, information about their sex life, but we're wonky legal and technical people, so we can't protect it unless we define it. If we're putting laws around it, what is it? And so LGBTQ data, SOGI data, can any of you help me with some more precise definitions?
Absolutely. I'll take a stab at the LGBTQ. So we have lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and questioning. It also goes further into asexual, two-spirited, which is indigenous, in particular North American indigenous tribes use that, and pansexual. So really describing a whole spectrum of folks who identify along the sexual orientation and gender identity spectrum, and in the ways that they either present or the way that they love. So, and SOGI is sexual orientation and gender identity, and depending, as Sarah said earlier, depending what journal you read, it may include an E, which is also just expression. So there's a couple different terms out there.
Okay, and in understanding, again, just to stick with what's on the list, when we see laws drafted, we see simply we're protecting sexual orientation, or we see sometimes sex life as terms that are used. Should proposed protections be more precise to kind of put more detailed parameters over what we're actually talking about protecting or not? I mean, there's a lot of information that sort of falls under the category of, this is about LGBT tech. Like where, what are the I's and E's and dots need to look like so that we're properly kind of scoping, not too broad and broad enough? Is that a topic that
I think it's,
Lynn
yeah.
and some of the crew here are working on a paper, FPF and LGBT tech? Is that kind of one of the pieces that you grapple with on the paper?
It is one of the pieces. Definitions are incredibly important, and how you use them in law really matters, particularly when we talk about something like LGBTQ data. Are we then leaving out individuals who don't identify as LGBTQ, but are still worried about their data being protected? And Jules, you mentioned sex life data, and that opens up a whole nother line of questions about what data is being protected and what isn't. As part of writing this paper, we looked over the 12 most recent federal bills, either introduced or drafted. And we actually found that they're very split on whether they, in the first part, carve out a specific niche for sensitive data, and whether that sensitive data category includes things like protecting an individual's sex life or protecting their sexual orientation. The majority of bills carve out sensitive data, but a few don't. And while a majority of bills do have this sensitive data provision, most of them don't include an anti-discrimination provision that also touches on gender orientation. So far we've only seen like one bill that covers all of these types of data in a way that's holistic and thoughtful.
Well, sometimes one of the arguments that you hear made for why you shouldn't have a definition of sensitive data is that, what data today in this world of, big data isn't sensitive. If I can learn things about your health from a loyalty card, any of my social media data, right, is likely to be indicative, perhaps. And so, do we risk, by defining what we're protecting, do we risk losing the scope of what we really want to protect because we've said it's only this? And number two, do we risk access to data that researchers or the community may want or need? I don't know, right now we're obviously worrying about whether COVID affects certain communities harder. You guys have worked on, how the shutdown, how does domestic violence, how does, violence against gays and lesbians, like we do also want to have access to some degree of information. Chris, a number of years ago, FPF did a paper with the ADL, primarily driven by the fact that we were only hearing about big data bad. And we said, big data is also how you combat and find discrimination. So I think this is a challenging.
Right, and you recall in that paper, we talked about a New York State study that wanted to collect data about LGBTQ people to ensure that they were getting the taxpayer-funded health services that they were entitled to. But unless the state knew about what services they were or were not receiving, they couldn't make judgments about where improvements were necessary. So sometimes sharing data is important to the health and safety of the LGBTQ community.
If I can back up what Chris was just saying there, certainly we need to have some definitions so that way not only can states identify what we are trying to measure, but also what it is that researchers can do. So one of the ways in which we can identify gaps in our understanding and gaps in our knowledge is by saying, these are the things that are known and these are the things that are unknown. So for example, as one of the commenters on LinkedIn had just pointed out, we've not talked about intersex data thus far. So if we're talking about LGBTQ and SOGI data broadly, but that does not yet in some jurisdictions include data about an intersex status, that also tells us something about ways that we need to advance research, advance funding for particular streams of research, or to think about ways in which we can redirect research streams towards either addressing proxy variables and how they have proxied or misproxied particular conditions, or particular identity expressions, and how it is that we expect that research to be used to feed back to those communities. If we hope that research has functioned as a feedback loop, we definitely want to know who we need to send the papers back to and give that access to, and create a more targeted sort of feedback environment.
Let's step back to the historical treatment of LGBTQ plus persons. If we're going to think about the proper way to legislate or to tell organizations to put rules and controls and what to do or not to do, if you come to the issue just today, you may miss some of the real dynamics that kind of brought us to where we are today. So I wonder if one of you might give us a little bit of sense of how some of the historical treatment has impacted some of the current conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think this has been one of the most eye-opening things in working on this paper with Caitlin. There's the historical knowledge that dating back to the 1950s and 1960s, but going back even further, we were able to find the ways that laws have been influenced by LGBTQ or have been really tied and linked to LGBTQ individuals, all the way back to just basic privacy of personal versus or in the home versus out of the home, and so. I think some of the biggest things to remember, especially as individuals that may not be as familiar with the treatment of LGBTQ in the United States in particular, is that some of the earliest laws around LGBTQ individuals, anti-sodomy laws, which impacted mainly gay men, and also lesbians who were working in the workforce, police raids of LGBTQ spaces, and the laws that were used to in order to give police and other federal agencies the right to do that, entrapment of individuals to expose them, the lavender scare, in government, and how that is, but
sorry.
hours. So
ice cream truck is outside.
and some of the ways that LGBTQ have been treated all the way up until, I mean, it's just recently that this past summer where it's illegal to fire someone for being gay or lesbian, but it doesn't necessarily protect everyone, when it comes to the other alphabet soup within the LGBTQ community. We don't have full protections yet. And we know that some of the cases are moving from the states into the Supreme Court now. There's been some challenges against some of those. So I'll let other people speak to this. And Caitlin, if you want to kind of jump in, I tried to give an overview, but I will say the historical treatment of LGBTQ individuals has not been great. And it has, I think it's created a lot of angst in our community to be open and honest. Sarah was mentioning how data could be helpful. Even Chris was mentioning how data could be helpful to help our community, and we beat that drum all the time. But if they don't feel comfortable in sharing data, then they're not going to share it, and it makes serving our community that much harder.
But Chris, haven't you found it to be the case that many in the LGBTQ community have embraced technology probably to a greater extent than their other cohorts?
Absolutely.
Because it's an amazing way to interact with others in the community, to date, to come out of the closet, to think about coming out of the closet, to share information, to share concerns, and it's all done. It can be done anonymously, or it can be done with privacy vis-a-vis certain groups of people, and it means that they have to rely to a really great extent on the companies providing the platforms and on the honesty and trustworthiness of those companies. And I think there's some cases where those companies weren't so great in terms of how they treated that information, or they subjected that information to a data security breach. So it wasn't volitional, but it was just sloppy and negligent.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right, Chris. Oftentimes, almost double the amount of LGBTQ individuals actually adopt technology at almost double the amount of their heterosexual counterparts. They're typically adopting mobile technology, higher speeds of broadband, different social media networks at double the rate of their heterosexual counterparts because of what you explained and the fact that it allows them to form community, form identity, and find others like them, especially for those that are living in rural or just very disconnected areas. It's extremely important. And one thing I love about having conversations with you is, there's the cons to collecting data, and then there's the pros. And I love the conversations and the back and forth that we have. So it's so true.
Chris, you mentioned the tools, and I guess one of the biggest debates in Washington going forward is going to be how companies are using tools to moderate, to try to deal with, bullying. Obviously, we all see the hearings, right? The Republicans want, conservative bias eliminated. The, others want hate taken down, more quickly. And I think there's been a history when it comes to some of the data we're talking about here. I remember back to my days at AOL and our parental controls, right, which wanted to keep kids safe. And that meant anything, that talked about sex was risky. And then you inadvertently had your, algorithms or your block lists taking down content where people were seeking, to discuss their identity, to get help, to connect. But it was labeled porn, right? Or it was labeled, inappropriate content. So, how do you think, and I haven't yet figured out whether the Section 230 debate is one that is about data protection, obviously when it comes to, so-called, photos that have been circulated without consent, you see sort of the real data collection issue there. But do you worry, or how do you think about these automated tools that always are going to miss nuance? And here you're talking about an area where nuance is so critical, right? The nuances, and where computers are almost, guaranteed to get it wrong. How do I know whether you're insulting someone or complimenting them in in context language, or talking in a mature way in a junior audience, or having a age appropriate conversation? Is this a place where we shouldn't rely on tools? They're just not going to work. I don't know if human moderators are any better when it comes to this sort of nuance.
Well, before we talk about the tools, let me just say one of my greatest concerns about an outright repeal of Section 230, as the president is trying to tie to the Defense Authorization Act, and which he's been promoting, and others as well, is that platforms and apps will err on the side of removing any information that they think they might have liability for. And so a lot of the information that we've been talking about that people want to share may be removed out of an abundance of caution so that the platforms can try to protect themselves from liability. So I'm very concerned about that. And at the same time, I don't know how you craft an amendment to Section 230 that deals with the moderation issue. Professor Daniel Citron has a proposal, Van Wittes as well, that calls for a reasonableness standard, sort of a negligence tort kind of standard, that if the platform is aware of a problem and doesn't do something about it, then it may be held liable. That may be the solution. There are lots of proposals that I think have to be considered first, but probably most of all, we need to understand what we're talking about. How big is this problem? How much information is getting out to people who shouldn't have access to it? But let me let the others talk specifically about the tools that are available today.
One of the things I would say that in response to this is we're talking about how it is that we can use automated systems, things like machine learning, to be able to identify text, to identify images, et cetera, to be excluded from, say, service on a particular platform. One of the things that I think harkens back to the historic discussion we were just having is that we tend, as in part of the LGBTQ community, to be early adopters of technology, but we're also innovators with language and symbols, right? So, Friends of Dorothy, Rainbow Coalition, rainbow flags, all of those things are part and parcel of the language around this community that when it's initially out there, it's code, and on purpose. It's a protective code. It's an inclusive code for that community, which then makes me think that the way to get around some of these questions about creating more inclusive systems, of creating algorithmic systems, machine learning systems that can include that language, so that we know if someone says uses a particular term, a particular symbol, that it's not a slur, that it's not slander or something like that, is to make sure that, well, there's LGBTQ people in tech, right? Making sure that we are writing the algorithms, that we're part of content moderation, that we're driving as much as we are sort of being served by some of these technological platforms.
And Sarah, and that they're counseling and advising the Facebooks of the world when they're making content moderation decisions, right?
Yeah, nothing about us without us, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, from our perspective, when we talk about Section 30, we share Chris's concerns about kind of the stifling of content. I think that one of the things that we found through our research was that YouTube was one of the most revolutionary platforms for transgender individuals. And one of the first places where transgender individuals were able to start doing kind of videos about transitioning and kind of playing with their identity. And it became a place where people came to a community for this. On the other side of that coin, we have, reports that some of these images were pulled for a research paper about transgender individuals without their permission, and they were used to train algorithms in a way that, it's not in any way meant to be harmful, but it was kind of a violation of privacy for people who were on YouTube, who were not intending for their images and their videos to be used this way. We also know that a lot of these algorithms, like Sarah said, we need to have diversity in the creation of these systems, or it's just not going to work. Facial recognition systems, for the most part, are still binary, male or female. They are not great at identifying non-binary individuals. They're not great at identifying transgender individuals. That's because in their creation, there were not enough people involved kind of raising these questions. So one of the main things that need to happen in the companies is, like Chris said, we need to have people involved at the beginning of the process from diverse backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds, LGBT backgrounds, other backgrounds, that can advise about these pitfalls before the systems get so kind of ingrained that it's impossible to put the genie back in the bottle.
Yeah, I wonder, let's maybe stick with the facial recognition piece for a second, because it feels like this is a place where there's a lot of complexity, right? Obviously there's been a fair amount of research showing that, darker skinned individuals are less likely to be treated accurately. And so the answer from some of the creators of the technology is, great, we'll find more black faces. And so wait a second, do we want facial recognition technology, which today does a blunt male, female, how many male females are in the room or whatever the other, uses are? Do we want research that somehow identifies, with some more specificity based on how people identify themselves and how they present? Is that more likely to be a, risky, unethical path for technology? Perhaps if you see some, medical application or something, there's a conversation to be had. But, kind of we need more data to be more accurate also, I think, scares some people, because is that actually an accuracy and a use that we want to see technology advance?
Do we want to make it to where that data is not accessible rather than owning that? So, Carlos, you just brought up the really salient point of what happens when people scrape YouTube or scrape Facebook or Instagram, et cetera, which are places that people go for communication, comfort, advice, et cetera. Being scraped is not a great thing. But what if we turn that around? What if instead we said, and we're going to actually own that and create a LGBTQ, transgender, intersex friendly training data set that would rival some of those other really big benchmark training data sets for facial recognition, for detection algorithms. And instead of being on the receiving end of tech that, was built because people want to be able to advance the purpose of FR, et cetera, may have gotten it wrong. What if we steer the ship and make it go right on our own accord?
Presumably, though, you want whoever is going to hold this data set to have some ethics review if researchers want it. Okay, why? Is it because you're supporting some, medical advance, or is it because I guess there are some who argue certain research paths are, eugenics are risky and immoral because of the history. And I guess we rely, at least in academic research, that this is the province of, IRBs. Maybe a word about what you're working on, which notes that maybe a company that wanted to create a fun app that did this, right? Or maybe some, social science planner of resource allocation. You may or may not want to see that happen, but today you don't have a IRB to go to. You look to ethics, but you may not actually have a structured ethical process. Maybe worth commenting a little bit on how you're trying to sort of fill that gap in creating ethical review outside of the traditional IRB for some of the uses that might be relevant to what we're talking about.
Sure. So what Jules is mentioning is that FPF is in the process of creating what's called the Ethical Data Sharing Review Committee, which is supposed to be an avenue for people to seek ethical review by a panel of qualified experts in data science, privacy, in domain-specific areas, such as, our excellent panelists from LGBT Tech today, to say, hey, is this data that's going to be used in this research project possibly going to cause harm? We have a well-established pattern of doing that in social science, medical science, even in animal care and use and research. But there's a big chunk of data that's somewhere out there that doesn't get reviewed. And as Carlos mentioned, sometimes that's just built to serve a researcher's need without consultation with the community, without consultation with an ethics committee, because, well, if you don't have to, you don't necessarily go through a process. So we're in the process of setting that up. And I think what you just outlined, Jules, is really probably an excellent test case for seeing whether or not the process we're establishing is the right one. Does it protect this community in particular, where we are constantly evolving the definitions of what the data is that we need to protect? if there's a better use case, well, not sure I've heard it yet. So maybe this is the best one we've got.
So let's turn from the high-minded thinking about research to the more practical, capitalistic type thinking of marketing. Let's put obvious discrimination and actual, clear physical and financial harms aside. Clearly, marketers market. They market to every sort of segment they can find, and they certainly market as we would want them to the LGBT communities, because people socialize, people buy, people have shopping patterns and habits, and there's obviously value to making it easy and the economy and competition. But by putting people in categories, I'm defining them, and that's marketing. What should we be telling marketers if I'm going to launch a campaign and I say, hey, wealthy gay white men, that's a target audience for me because my product is going to be popular, my vacation is going to be popular. Clearly, this is something marketers do. It doesn't seem like it's offensive, but on the other hand, you can see ways where it might be demeaning to be defining, well, I don't identify like that, and I'm in that campaign. Everyone talks about the Target example of, pregnancy-related marketing, but as much as we laugh about that, if you're pregnant, you get marketed to, and it's probably not leaving aside disclosing, information, you're shopping for stuff and you want the offers because you've never purchased high chairs before and all that sort of thing. So how do we think about the right parameters around marketing, which is discrimination, right? It means I'm going to offer, I'm going to discriminate about who I give my product to.
So Jules, I get the hard copy of Out and Advocate, right? And it still boggles my mind that they come in plain brown wrappers. Essentially, they come with the cover of the magazine hidden, so my mailman doesn't know I'm gay. Which is just bizarre. But I know that I'm on mailing lists because of my subscription to these folks, and I get mailed advertisements. So the question I think you're posing is, what about online? And you can refresh our collective recollections about what did the Network Advertising Initiative do several years ago with respect to categorizing the LGBTQ community? Do they allow that as a segment that can be marketed to online?
Caitlin?
NIA has sexual orientation as a sensitive category and allows for opt-outs. So has carved out.
Yeah, and this is not the case, frankly, for the broader online advertising and marketing community, where, for example, if I go to a number of sites, I now may be put into a category, my cookie or my mobile ad ID, I might be labeled gay based on what sites I went to. And then at other sites, I could get ads targeted. Now, that might be surprising. I'm going to New York Times or something, and here are some ads that seem to be targeted to me. Obviously, there's concerns about outing people, or just why does this other website know this sensitive information about me? So
Jules, you're a metrosexual. You must get mistaken in some of those advertisements.
Well, luckily, Mark Groman, when he was the executive director of the NAI, this was an issue he felt passionately about, and he really kind of did the work and brought along the companies. So, the 70 or 80 kind of leading ad networks, from, Google to, third-party tracking companies you never heard of, if I go to, a gay-oriented site, they may deliver a relevant ad, but they're not going to put me in a bucket that's linked to my sexual orientation that then will, travel around the internet with me. But it has not been fully accepted. And obviously offline, this still seems to be, an area of, it's less transparent perhaps, but it still seems to be an area that is in need of some guidance.
Yeah, I can think of a good real world example to tie this back to facial recognition too. In 2019, and Oz Keys wrote about this, Berlin started offering discounts to women for their metro passes on the basis of their facial recognition results. And obviously that was incredibly problematic because it was basically telling metro riders what their gender was and giving some discounts and some not. And then also kind of enforcing this really bifurcated and rigid structure of what gender is. And so we could see something like that happening in the corporate world that would have very similar harmful results. And we see this happening already with insurers offering different rates to trans individuals, individuals getting different, ads for housing. This is kind of going more underground. This is discrimination that is now turned into something more akin to algorithmic bias and is perpetuating the same sorts of harms that we've seen historically. And I do want to ask a question of Carlos too, because he just mentioned this a few days ago when we last spoke, about especially around medical privacy and how the LGBTQ community might be loath to adopt certain technologies or use certain tools, even if those tools would help them in the public health context when it comes to COVID.
Yeah, absolutely. We were talking about contact tracing, and I think, historically, HIV laws were weaponized against the LGBTQ community and gay men. To getting a positive HIV test result could mean loss of employment, drop of insurance. So I think there is kind of a history of discrimination based on medical status. And when we talk about contact tracing, it seems a little neutral, but I can point out a couple of examples where this comes into play for the LGBTQ community and why the LGBTQ community might not be as eager to opt into a system like this. In South Korea, there was a 29-year-old man who was identified as being a carrier of COVID. And South Korea allows location tracing of individuals to be posted so that the other individuals can see where they've been and maybe get tested. This 29-year-old man traveled in a mainly LGBT area of Seoul. It was kind of a district that was known to have a number of gay bars and restaurants and nightclubs. As a result of his identification and location of where he went, a number of newspapers, Christian newspaper and a number of conservative people started calling for the shutdown of the whole LGBT neighborhood and started blaming people in that neighborhood for spreading COVID. And so now there was this whole link between, there's this gay person, quote unquote, walking around spreading this virus. We should shut down the whole area. In Uganda, contact tracing laws, social distancing laws were used to arrest 13 gay men that were at a shelter. They were at a shelter that were getting services for COVID. The police came in and arrested them under the social distancing law, saying they were gathered there against, the rules of the state. So laws can be neutral, but the way they're applied and the way that people enforce these policies can be discriminatory. And I think that the LGBT community has seen that time and time again through its history, including the HIV crisis, and now when the COVID crisis has started to pop a little bit. So there is a distrust there. And there's going to have to be more work with the LGBTQ community to convince them that these apps are safe and that they're not going to be outed and that they're not going to be discriminated against as a result of using some of these health techniques.
There was a big flap, obviously, when Apple and Google announced that they were going to support these exposure notification APIs. In large part, they were acting in response to health departments around the world who were trying to leverage phones. You have a phone. Why can't that be a tool? And South Korea and other countries sort of built apps that, encourage you to share your location, turn on location tracking. And then you end up with incidents like the one that you described. So I think sensitive to some of the messes that were happening, but also the demand from some health departments to say, why do you have this device locked down in a way that we can't use Bluetooth? Mm-hmm. Bluetooth only works when and scans, when the phone is on. Well, someone's not going to spread COVID or get COVID, only when their phone is on. It's going to be off. It's going to be in their pants. It's going to be, sleeping. Let us use and kind of have broader access to Bluetooth scanning. And so when Apple and Google kind of came up with this very conservative model today where the Bluetooth does scan, but it sends no data to nobody. It just keeps track for you of what other phones you were near with a constantly sort of rotating hash sort of identifier, and similarly lets those phones keep track. And then if I get a diagnosis, I'm able to put a code in, and then my phone now is able to alert all the other devices that have seen this number. So it's really anonymized in a very effective way, so much so that health departments are not getting information. Well, what area, what region, where is this spreading? But yet at least might tell me, hey, go into quarantine, you were exposed, or get tested, and reduce my risk. So, it's been written a lot about as the big tech companies, looking to do this. I mean, they probably rather have never gotten involved with it. But I think, we're pulled into it because health departments saw the need, and they needed to figure out, do you take the most high privacy road, which they did, which definitely has some downsides. We won't know how well it even works, right? Because we're not getting this information. But on the other hand, it's at least a tool that hopefully is useful. So Carlos mentioned South Korea. So this is International Human Rights Day, right? What do we know about what the state in other countries are when it comes to data-related protections? We know GDPR obviously has, an important special category data. They don't call it sensitive data. They call it special category data. And there are higher restrictions on whether you can collect that data. Do we know much about how we see laws around the world spreading to include sex life or sexual orientation as a protected, you may not collect it?
So I know that it's still legal to be, it's illegal to be LGBT in, I believe, 70 countries around the globe, and that's punishable by prison time all the way to death.
So you're certainly not getting protections in privacy law around that data.
No,
Chris,
not at
Chris,
all.
Did you say 70? 70?
70, yes.
Unbelievable.
It is. You're looking at, maybe one in South America, a whole host of them in Africa, and then the Middle East, where LGBTQ face a lot of persecution. And I think this is important also to recognize as someone who has traveled to the UAE and stuff. I mean, it's nerve-wracking to think about, and also, even some of our board members have traveled to Russia and other places where they took burner phones and didn't connect them to any social media or anything because they didn't know what information was going to be shared, across those networks. And I think it's a huge risk. And I'm not necessarily sure every LGBTQ individual is thinking about it, but if you are traveling internationally, it is something that you should be thinking about because you have no idea who's watching what when you enter.
Well, my husband and I stupidly were in Zambia. Zambia was great. We saw Victoria Falls, and our tour guide said, "Oh, you get a much better view from the Zimbabwe side, and you have to do a border crossing,
right,
just for the day." So we went through the passport control to go to see Victoria Falls, and the guard took my passport, and then he took my husband's passport. And he said, "You two live at the same house?" He said, "I had our address in it." And we were actually very concerned that we were going to be arrested or attacked during our 20 minutes in Zimbabwe to look at Victoria Falls.
And I think that's where, this, here in the United States, the collection and the use of the data is, and how how companies are using it, especially because, as Jules, you mentioned, there's a lot of these companies that have a global footprint, and so they're looking at it from the perspective of, well, how do we protect users globally, regardless of where they are, and still allow individuals to gain information or gain community from using these tools and do it safely. Because as Christopher Wolf mentioned, the last thing a company wants to do is face charges or have the platform take the hit for something that shouldn't be on there or is illegal in that particular country. And so, and I think that can also weigh in, the ways I've seen it. We've seen with GDPR where some of the more strict laws around privacy just become the norm. But does that benefit the LGBTQ community? Are we losing potential research? And as Sarah had mentioned earlier, the research is extremely important for our community, and we have very little data in retrospect to the society overall. There's so little data around LGBTQ individuals, which makes it very hard for us to help them around healthcare issues, help them around housing, employment issues, and then layered with the complexities of the historical treatment or the current treatment and their unwillingness to share that information because of the fear of their safety and their livelihood.
Well, let's come back from Zimbabwe to the U.S. The great state of California passed last 2 years ago, I guess, the CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act, which had no structure for sensitive data, certainly LGBTQ data or anything like that. Now we have a new ballot initiative that just became law. It does have sensitive data, but it doesn't have restrictions on collecting. It only would, Caitlin, I'll let you take it from there. It only lets you have a opt out of any incompatible secondary uses of the data.
Yeah, so the CPRA has that opt-out that Jules mentioned, and it's only for sexual orientation or sex life data, along with a whole host of other types, but it doesn't mention all of this kind of multivariate data that we're talking about right now. And it really does seem like this is going to hopefully become more of the norm to be more thoughtful on sensitive data categories, although it's not quite there yet. In terms of how it compares internationally, we are researching a little bit more about China, Brazil, and India. It looks like even Brazil has a sensitive data provision that covers sexual orientation. But one thing that Chris always mentions is that the LGBTQ community is not a monolith. So what works in other countries might not work here. The LGBT community takes a multivariate approach to their data. It sounds like from our conversation, individuals might be worried where their data goes in one context and not in the other, whose hands it's in, and the privacy and ongoing security of that information. So the CPRA's limit the sale or disclosure of my sensitive data button might not be enough, but we will.
But by default, you can sell, share, give away even sensitive data on the CPRA. So, one of the reasons why we think, at least, at FPF, and I think all you guys, that we need a national federal law. The leading federal proposals create, hey, for sensitive data, such as what we're talking about, you need higher standard of permission to collect it in the first place. CPRA basically says, yeah, you can sell this data, you can do what you want. Oh, you have to have a opt out of sale, button. And now with the CPRA building on CCPA, yes, also an opt out of the incompatible secondary use, but the default is that you can even sell it. So, that's a pretty big gap. It's why I think a lot of civil society groups, opposed it, but the voters of California decided it shall be, and I guess we will see what happens. What did we miss? We've got a couple minutes before we'll wrap. Any other key parts from the paper that the team wants to call out and mention that you think is going to be helpful and useful?
I think it's important to note just how deeply intertwined privacy in general is with LGBTQ human rights. When we're talking about privacy, we're going back to the 1800s and the very origins of privacy. We also look into cases like Griswold, Connecticut, and Lawrence v. Texas, for things like, the right to conception and striking down anti-sodomy laws, and how privacy has largely been conflated with sex and sexuality, and the right to privacy in one's bedroom, and how that impacts all of our careers, and how that impacts privacy today, and what that'll look like in a federal comprehensive bill. So I think that's something to keep in mind, is that if you're interested in privacy today, we need to have conversations about the privacy of LGBTQ individuals yesterday.
So is it fair to say, obviously the civil rights community broadly, deeply cares about your rights issues generally, civil rights issues. they are increasingly also focused on how data is being used for discrimination and algorithmic harms and so forth. There have been civil rights principles, but it might be that the LGBTQ community, where disclosure and historic discrimination because information was disclosed, perhaps as opposed to I'm being discriminated against because of the color of my skin, it's not a, it's less of a secret fact or when I'm going to come out as, as Latinx or so forth. It might be that this is just going to be an issue that the LGBT community perhaps has highest or higher on its agenda than others who are just juggling sometimes pressing, concerns. Is that a fair statement? I mean, you guys have taken this on, as an important issue. Is it perhaps one of the issues that, this corner of the civil rights community is likely to be most interested in for those reasons?
I think so. I feel like, even some of the conversations we've had within our community may not necessarily see the harms or benefits or why it may be unique for LGBTQ around technology use in general. And so I do feel like even from the very beginning of starting LGBT tech, we've had to do some explaining about what is, my favorite question was, what is gay about technology? And it has nothing to do with the technology itself, but the user and the way that it's used differently. And so I do think it will continue to rise in the LGBTQ community. I feel like not only we're very focused on the tech portion of it and work with a lot of our other national LGBT organizations that are more society driven and working on societal issues, but they're seeing the importance of it and they're seeing where certain laws have impacted LGBTQ individuals. And so I also have heard, especially this year, in general, of other minority groups calling on their minority brothers and sisters and family members to support one another regardless of that. I think, in the African American community, the Latinx community, there have been, maybe some more outspoken people against LGBTQ individuals, yet there are LGBTQ individuals in those minorities. And so we've also seen where other minorities have really stepped up and said, how can you say, don't hold us down and make sure that we're supported and support, Black Lives Matter and so on and so forth, but then turn around and say someone LGBTQ is less than you. So we've seen a lot of that as well. So I think it will rise, within the LGBTQ community, but I also think that other minority communities are seeing the value in paying attention to these issues together and all, rising all ships. So I've seen it both ways.
Quick closing thoughts from everybody. I'll give you 30 seconds to give us a key item that we didn't think about or that you want to reemphasize. Chris, I'll start with you.
So we've talked a lot about the responsibilities of platforms, technology companies, legislators, regulators, but we really haven't talked about how privacy is a shared responsibility. And individuals need to be protective of their own data and be vigilant about what it is they're sharing and who they're sharing it with and on what platform they're sharing it. Obviously, the larger responsibility falls on the companies who do this for a living. But still, I think individuals within the LGBT community not only need to be aware, but probably need to get better information about how to be an informed consumer, if you will.
Thanks, Chris. Sarah, final thought.
Yeah, I absolutely couldn't agree more with Chris. Like, it comes down to what we consume. Let's not forget, what Chris Wood brought out, that we are major consumers of technology. We vote with our dollars, we vote with our feet. If we're concerned that a technology company, their products, their algorithms, whatever, are causing harm, there are alternatives. Drive the competition towards the ethical alternative that you believe serves your ethics and serves the communities that you're part of, whether or not they're single communities, but as everyone has also pointed out, if they're intersectional communities, right? Making sure that we respect all the pluralities that we happen to be. Make sure ethics is for everyone, even when you're deciding whether or not
Sarah.
to
Carlos.
purchase.
Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate the point that you made, Jules, about why is it so important to the LGBTQ community? I think there's two sides to this. One, we do have more data out there from an earlier point because we are going online, and we have a lot more sensitive data that we may not want to share with other people. And on the other side of that, the catastrophic consequences of data leaks for our community could be great. We're one of the few minorities where we can be discriminated in our own home. Most other minorities, you can go home and have a safe space. We may not be safe in our own home. So a data leak does not just mean unemployment, does not just mean health issues. It may mean losing your family and losing all of your social support. So for anyone looking at these laws, LGBTQ individuals are especially vulnerable and they're especially plugged in. So that combination can make it really hard for companies to do this in a way that protects the data that needs to be protected.
Important points. Chris Wood, and then Caitlin, will let you have the last word.
I'll just do a plug. I agree with everything that has been said here, but I will do a plug for the paper. I'm just really excited to have that released, hopefully in 2021, early 2021. We're definitely working through several reviews, and it's just been an awesome experience to go down this path and look at privacy in a deeper way for the LGBTQ community. And we look forward not only to that, but continuing and expanding research for the LGBTQ community, because that's the only way we can ensure that privacy and protections and that all these tools work better for the community. So thanks for today.
Thanks, Caitlin.
I think, I want to echo everything everyone said. It was so wonderful to speak to you all. These are my favorite kinds of conversations, and it's just been fantastic working with you. I want to echo the fact that when we discuss, harms and benefits, we also need to think about intersectionality and how these sorts of technologies impact folks at the intersection. And so, like Carlos mentioned, LGBTQ persons can be discriminated against in our own homes. When we think about that in the COVID context, we think about so many individuals going back into their homes and back into their closets and the way that privacy can have an impact on their lives. We think about contact tracing with LGBTQ communities who might be less likely to adopt these technologies, even though they're more likely to use technology in general because of the AIDS crisis and required medical disclosures. We think about individuals who are not able to have access to a phone, who are also LGBTQ and live in rural communities. And we think about the fact that even like pulse oximeters or technologies we rely on have been known to give faulty results to people on the basis of the color of their skin. So it's really important to think about intersectionality when we think about the use of data and the deployment of new technologies.
Thank you. We're on my page because I have a bit of a megaphone here, but you should be following, please, the LGBT Tech org, the FPF org here, LinkedIn, Twitter, elsewhere, to stay up to date on what happens of our paper, which we will have out soon. So stay tuned. And we look forward to working with you all. Anyway, thanks all of you for joining today and for a great conversation.
Thank you for great moderation.
Thank you all. Thanks, Joel.
Thank you.